You're holding us back, Mom. The words hit me like ice water on a burning wound, spoken by the daughter I had sacrificed everything for. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if you, for even a second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Barbara. I'm 73 years old, and I used to believe that love meant giving until there was nothing left of yourself. I believed that being a good Christian mother meant enduring every slight, every cruel word, every moment of being treated like I was invisible in my own daughter's house. The house I had sold everything to help her buy. The morning it all crumbled, I had been kneeling beside my small bed in what used to be the guest room of Emily's house in Charlotte, North Carolina. My arthritic knees pressed against the thin carpet as I clutched my worn rosary, the same one my mother had pressed into my hands 50 years ago. The beads were smooth from decades of desperate prayers, each Hail Mary a plea for peace in a home that had grown colder with each passing month. "Heavenly Father," I whispered, my voice barely audible through the thin walls, "help me understand what you want from me. Help me love them better." I had learned to pray in whispers. 3 years ago, Emily had told me that my loud praying made the house feel heavy and old-fashioned. So I learned to commune with God in silence, like a secret I had to keep even from my own family. The August sun streamed through the tiny window, casting long shadows across the cramped space that had become my entire world. On the nightstand sat a single framed photo, Emily's college graduation, where she had hugged me tight and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom." That was back when my sacrifices still mattered. When my love was still wanted. I could hear them downstairs. Emily, her husband Richard, and my 2 precious grandchildren, Tyler and Grace. Their voices carried the easy warmth of a family discussing their day, planning their future, living their lives. Lives that somehow had no space for the woman who had given up her own home, her savings, her independence to be near them. Rising slowly from my knees, each joint protesting the movement, I smoothed my simple blue dress, one of the 3 I owned now, since I had sold most of my belongings to help with their down payment. I had kept only what fit in 2 suitcases, believing that love required such sacrifice, believing that a good Christian woman puts her family's comfort before her own. The hallway felt longer each day as I walked toward the kitchen, passing family photos that told the story of their life without me. Emily's wedding, where I had been cropped out of most pictures because Richard's family thought it looked more elegant with fewer people. The children's birthdays, where I appeared only in the background, always the helper, never the celebrated. Vacations I had paid for, but wasn't invited to join because I would change the dynamic. "Good morning," I said softly as I entered the kitchen, where Emily was making coffee in the expensive machine I had bought her last Christmas. She didn't look up from her phone. "Morning," she replied, the word clipped and distant. Richard sat at the breakfast bar, absorbed in his laptop, something about pharmaceutical reports that always seemed to stress him. He acknowledged me with the barest nod, the kind you give to service staff. Grace, my 15-year-old granddaughter, was scrolling through her phone while picking at a piece of toast. Tyler, 13, was already dressed for school, his backpack slung over his shoulder. They were beautiful children, but they barely knew me. How could they? I was just the quiet old woman who lived in their house, who whispered her prayers and tried to stay out of everyone's way. "Grace, sweetheart," I said gently, "don't forget you have that history test today. I could help you review." "She's fine, Mom," Emily cut me off, still not looking up from her phone. "She doesn't need help." The rejection stung, but I had learned to absorb such moments like a sponge absorbs water, silently, completely, until I was saturated with hurt I couldn't express. This was my penance, I told myself. This was what loving family looked like sometimes. Even Jesus was rejected by those he loved most. I poured myself a small cup of coffee and retreated to the corner of the kitchen, making myself as small as possible. I watched my family prepare for their day, a day that would happen without me, in offices and schools where I didn't exist, among friends who had never heard my name mentioned. "The Hendersons are coming for dinner Saturday," Richard announced, finally speaking. "Big account, so we need everything perfect." Emily nodded enthusiastically. I'll make that salmon dish. And we can use the good china. I remained silent, though I knew they were talking about the china set I had given them, my mother's china, the only valuable thing I had inherited. I also knew I wouldn't be invited to join them for dinner. I never was when Richard's business associates came over. Emily always found a reason for me to eat in my room or visit my friend Winona that evening. Tyler needs new soccer cleats, Emily continued, scrolling through her banking app. And Grace wants to join the debate team, but there's a fee. I opened my mouth to offer to pay. My Social Security check always went toward their needs anyway. But Richard held up his hand. Don't, he said firmly, looking directly at me for the first time that morning. We can handle our children's expenses ourselves. The message was clear. Your help isn't wanted anymore. Your sacrifices aren't appreciated. You're not family. You're a burden who happens to share their DNA. I finished my coffee in silence and retreated to my room, where I spent most of my days now. The walls seemed closer together each morning, pressing in like the weight of unspoken words. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my Bible to Psalm 31. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. But as I read those familiar words, a new feeling crept into my heart. Not the peace I usually found in Scripture, but a growing awareness that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not with God's love, but with how I was allowing myself to be treated in His name. Was this really what He wanted for one of His children? Was this really the love He commanded families to show? Outside my small window, the neighborhood was coming alive. Children walked to school with parents who kissed them goodbye. Neighbors waved to each other across driveways. Normal families living normal lives, where love didn't require erasure, where belonging didn't demand invisibility. I closed my Bible and stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. When had I become so small? When had I learned to whisper instead of speak, to hide instead of exist, to apologize for needing space to breathe? The house grew quiet as everyone left for their day. Emily's car pulling out of the driveway marked the beginning of another long day of solitude, broken only by household chores no one acknowledged, and meals I prepared for a family that barely thanked me. But today felt different. Today, as I knelt again for my morning prayers, I found myself asking God a different question. Am I being tested or just forgotten? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of a truth I was finally ready to hear. 6 years. That's how long I had been living in Emily's house, and as I sat in the suffocating quiet of my small room, memories flooded back like a dam bursting open. Each recollection carried the weight of sacrifice I had made in the name of Christian love, choices that had slowly stripped away pieces of my identity, until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. It had started the day after Harold's funeral. I was 67 then, standing in the empty house we had shared for 43 years of marriage, surrounded by sympathy cards and casserole dishes from church ladies who meant well but couldn't fill the crater that his death had left in my heart. Emily had found me sitting at our kitchen table, Harold's coffee mug still unwashed in the sink, because I couldn't bear to erase that last trace of our morning routine. "Mom, you can't stay here alone," she had said, her voice carrying that tone of reasonable concern that I would later recognize as the beginning of my erasure. "This house is too big for one person. Too expensive. Too full of memories that will just make you sad." I should have said that memories were all I had left of the man who had loved me unconditionally for 4 decades. I should have said that our house was where I felt closest to God, where Harold and I had raised our daughter, where every corner held prayers answered and blessings received. But Emily seemed so certain, so authoritative in her assessment of what was best for me. "We've been talking," she continued, glancing at Richard, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You could sell this place and move in with us, help with the kids, be part of a real family again instead of rattling around in this old house by yourself. Part of a real family." The words had sounded like salvation then. Now they tasted like poison in my memory. The selling of my home had been swift and brutal. Emily handled everything with the efficiency of someone disposing of outdated inventory. 43 years of marriage reduced to an estate sale where strangers rifled through my wedding china, my grandmother's quilts, Harold's woodworking tools. I watched from the window as pieces of our life together were carried away by people who saw only objects, not the love stories each item represented. "You don't need all this stuff, Mom," Emily had said, boxing up photo albums without looking at them. "You're starting fresh. New chapter, clean slate." But I wasn't starting fresh. I was being erased, one memory at a time. The money from the house sale, $180,000 after paying off the mortgage, had gone directly into Emily and Richard's account. "For your care," they had explained. "And to help with the new mortgage. You'll essentially be buying into our home, becoming a partner in our family's success." I had signed the papers with shaking hands, believing that my financial contribution would secure my place in their lives, that my sacrifice would be rewarded with belonging. How naive I had been. The first few months had been hopeful. I had my own room, small but private. I helped with cooking, cleaning, watching Tyler and Grace after school. I felt useful, needed. When Grace skinned her knee, she ran to me for comfort. When Tyler struggled with math homework, I sat with him at the kitchen table, patiently explaining fractions until they made sense. "Grandma makes the best pancakes," Grace had announced one Sunday morning, and my heart had soared. This was what I had prayed for, to be integral to my family's happiness, to have my love received and returned. But slowly, subtly, the boundaries began to appear. "Mom, you don't need to make dinner every night," Emily had said after about 6 months. "Richard and I like to cook together. It's our thing." "You're watching too much TV with the kids," came next. "They need to learn independence." "The house feels crowded with 3 adults," Richard had added during one of their carefully choreographed conversations. "Maybe you could spend more time in your room. Give us space to be a family." Each restriction felt reasonable in isolation. Each boundary seemed minor. But together, they formed a cage that grew smaller with each passing month. I began to notice that family photos were taken when I was at the store, that school events were attended without me, that birthday parties and holidays were celebrated in whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. "We didn't want to overwhelm you," Emily would say when I discovered I had missed Grace's school play or Tyler's soccer game. "You seem tired lately. We thought you needed rest." But I wasn't tired. I was disappearing. The financial control had been the most insidious change. My Social Security checks were deposited into a joint account that Emily managed. "For household expenses," she explained. "Groceries, utilities, your share of everything." But I never saw statements. Never knew how much was spent or what remained. When I asked for $20 to buy a birthday gift for my friend Winona, Emily sighed as if I were asking for a kidney. "Mom, we're trying to save money. Do you really need to buy presents for people outside the family?" Outside the family. As if my friendships were betrayals of my commitment to them. I had started carrying a small notebook, secretly tracking the money I contributed versus what I actually cost them. My Social Security, my portion of the house sale money, the occasional checks I wrote for Tyler's school trips, or Grace's dance lessons. By my calculations, I was contributing far more than I consumed. But questioning their financial management was treated as ingratitude, as evidence that I didn't trust their judgment. "We're taking care of you," Richard would say whenever I raised concerns. "Housing, food, healthcare coordination. Do you know how much a nursing home would cost?" The threat was always there, hovering beneath the surface of every conversation. "Behave, or we'll send you away. Be grateful, or lose what little you have left." My prayer life had become a constant negotiation with God. Every morning, kneeling beside my bed, I would beg for understanding. "Help me be more grateful, Lord. Help me see the blessings in this situation. Help me love them better." I would flip through my Bible, searching for verses about honoring family, about patient endurance, about finding joy in suffering. I memorized 1 Corinthians 13. "Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud." But late at night, when the house was quiet and I could hear Emily and Richard laughing together in their bedroom, I would whisper different prayers, desperate prayers. "God, why do I feel so alone? Why does my presence seem to burden the people I love most? Am I failing some test of faith?" The silence from heaven felt complete, as if God himself had joined my family in finding me inconvenient. Last Christmas had been the breaking point I couldn't admit to myself at the time. I had spent weeks crocheting scarves for Tyler and Grace, staying up late in my room to finish them in time. I had used my small emergency fund to buy Emily a beautiful necklace and Richard a book he had mentioned wanting. Christmas morning, I sat in the corner of the living room, watching my family exchange gifts. My presents were opened with polite smiles and quickly set aside. Tyler's scarf never left the box. Grace's was tried on once and immediately taken off, but it was Emily's gift to Richard that shattered something inside me. A framed photo of their family, Emily, Richard, Tyler, and Grace, taken during a vacation I had paid for but not been invited to join. The photo was beautiful, professional, perfect, and I was nowhere in it. "This is perfect," Richard had said, kissing Emily's cheek. "Our beautiful family." I had excused myself to the bathroom and wept silently, one hand pressed over my mouth to muffle the sobs. When I returned, they were discussing plans for New Year's Eve, plans that clearly didn't include me. Now, sitting in my small room 6 months later, I realized that Christmas morning had been a message I was too afraid to receive. I wasn't part of their beautiful family. I was the elderly relative they tolerated out of obligation, the burden they carried because Christian families don't abandon their parents, even when they desperately want to. I opened my Bible to Isaiah 49:15. "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you." The verse was meant to comfort, but it only highlighted the bitter irony of my situation. I was the mother who couldn't forget, living with the child who seemed to have no compassion for the woman who had borne her. Outside my window, I could see Mrs. Patterson watering her garden next door. She was about my age, living alone since her husband's death 2 years ago, but she looked content, peaceful even, tending to her flowers with the careful attention of someone who had found purpose in simple pleasures. When had I last felt peaceful? When had I last done something simply because it brought me joy, rather than because it might earn me approval from people who seemed incapable of giving it? I closed my Bible and stared at my hands. Hands that had changed thousands of diapers, cooked thousands of meals, written thousands of checks to support a family that now treated me like an unwelcome guest in their home. "Am I being tested?" I whispered to the empty room, "or just forgotten?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and dangerous, carrying the weight of a truth I was finally ready to face. The morning of my 73rd birthday arrived with the same crushing silence that had become my daily companion. I woke in my small room, sunlight filtering through curtains I had sewn myself from remnants Emily had deemed too old-fashioned for the main house. For a moment, in that space between sleep and consciousness, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today my family would remember that I existed for reasons beyond paying bills and staying invisible. I dressed carefully in my best blue dress, the one I had worn to Grace's confirmation, though I had been seated in the back of the church while Emily's in-laws filled the front pews. My arthritic fingers fumbled with the small pearl earrings Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary, the only jewelry I had left after contributing my wedding ring's gold value to Tyler's summer camp fund. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Emily stood at the counter, packing lunchboxes with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had reduced motherhood to a series of tasks to be completed. Richard sat hunched over his laptop, muttering about quarterly reports and FDA approvals for some new pharmaceutical study. Tyler grabbed a piece of toast while balancing his soccer gear, and Grace applied lip gloss while scrolling through her phone. "Good morning," I said softly, the words carrying more hope than they should have. Emily glanced up briefly. "Morning, Mom. Did you remember to schedule your doctor's appointment? Dr. Martinez said your blood pressure medication needs adjusting. Not happy birthday. Not, how did you sleep? Just another item on her mental checklist of Barbara-related tasks that needed managing. I waited. Surely someone would remember. Surely, in the rush of their morning routine, one of them would pause and acknowledge that 73 years ago today, I had entered this world. That this day had once been celebrated, had once mattered to someone. "I'll call Dr. Martinez after breakfast," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The meal continued around me. Tyler complained about his math teacher, Grace asked for money for a school trip to Washington, D.C. Richard announced he would be late for dinner because of a client meeting. Normal family conversation that flowed over and around me like water around a stone, acknowledging my presence only when I became an obstacle to their current. As they prepared to leave, I finally gathered the courage to speak. "It's my birthday today." The words hung in the air like a confession, vulnerable and desperate. Emily paused with her car keys in her hand, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Embarrassment, perhaps, or irritation at being reminded of an obligation she had forgotten. "Oh, right. Happy birthday, Mom." The words were hollow, delivered with the same tone she used to thank the grocery store cashier. We'll do something this weekend, maybe, when things aren't so crazy." But we both knew they wouldn't. This weekend would bring its own emergencies, its own priorities that somehow never included the woman who had given up everything to be near them. Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. Tyler mumbled, "Happy birthday, Grandma," while shouldering his backpack. Grace blew me a distracted kiss and disappeared out the door. And then they were gone, leaving me alone with the echo of Emily's promise and the certainty that it would be forgotten before she reached the end of the driveway. I spent the morning of my 73rd birthday cleaning their house, scrubbing bathrooms they never thanked me for maintaining, washing clothes they never acknowledged I laundered, preparing a dinner they would eat while discussing their days, their plans, their lives that had no room for my contributions. At noon, my phone rang. Winona's voice, warm and familiar, filled the empty kitchen. "Happy birthday, sweet friend. How are you celebrating?" I couldn't answer immediately. The kindness in her voice, the simple fact that someone had remembered had marked this day as significant, broke something open in my chest that I had been holding closed for months. "They forgot," I whispered, the admission tasting like betrayal. Good Christian mothers didn't complain about their families. Good Christian mothers found joy in serving others, in being unnoticed and unappreciated. "Oh, Barbara." Winona's voice carried a weight of understanding that made me realize she had been watching my slow disappearance with growing concern. "Come over. Right now. We'll celebrate properly." But I couldn't leave. What if Emily came home early? What if she needed something and I wasn't there to provide it? My worth in this house had been reduced to my availability, my willingness to be invisible until needed. "I can't," I said. "I need to be here." "Barbara, honey, you need to be somewhere you're valued. Come over, please." After she hung up, I sat at the kitchen table where I ate my meals in silence while my family discussed their lives. I opened my Bible to Psalms, searching for comfort in familiar verses. But the words seemed to blur together. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Was I brokenhearted? I had been telling myself I was blessed, grateful, serving God through serving my family. But sitting alone in their house on my birthday, invisible and forgotten, I wondered if God really wanted his children to disappear so completely that their own families forgot they existed. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt both rebellious and necessary. I walked to the neighborhood grocery store and bought myself a small birthday cake. Chocolate with white frosting, the kind Harold used to surprise me with when we were young and money was tight but love was abundant. I brought it home and placed it on the kitchen counter, along with a single candle I found in Emily's baking supplies. When evening came and my family returned from their day, I stood beside my small cake, waiting for someone to notice. Emily walked through the kitchen without a glance. Richard headed straight to his office. Tyler went upstairs to his room. Only Grace paused, her young face confused. "Grandma, what's the cake for?" "It's my birthday," I said simply. Grace's eyes widened with genuine surprise and what looked like embarrassment. "Mom?" she called toward the living room where Emily was sorting mail. "It's Grandma's birthday." Emily appeared in the doorway, and I saw the moment she realized her mistake. Her face flushed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Richard's voice cut through the awkward silence. "Well, sing to her then," he said from the kitchen doorway, his tone suggesting this was an inconvenience he was willing to endure for 30 seconds. They gathered around the counter, Emily, Richard, Tyler, and Grace, and sang Happy Birthday with the enthusiasm of people fulfilling an obligation. Their voices were flat, their smiles forced, their eyes looking anywhere but at me. I made a wish and blew out my single candle. In that moment, surrounded by my family yet feeling utterly alone, I wished for something I had never dared ask God for before: the courage to matter. To exist as more than a convenient ghost who paid bills and stayed quiet. "Thanks, Mom," Emily said quickly, already moving away from the counter. "We'll have to get you a real present this weekend." But I knew there would be no real present. This moment, this forced, awkward acknowledgement of my existence, was all I would receive, and somehow that felt worse than being forgotten entirely. That night, I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. The forgotten birthday, the obligatory song, the promise that would never be kept. I thought about the woman I used to be, Barbara Morrison, elementary school teacher, Harold's beloved wife, Emily's devoted mother. I thought about the woman who had once mattered, whose opinions were sought, whose presence was welcomed. When had I become so small? When had I learned to be grateful for scraps of attention from people who treated me like an unwelcome houseguest in a home I had helped purchase? I reached for my Bible, seeking comfort in familiar passages, but found myself turning to verses I had never paid attention to before. Matthew 10:37. "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." For the first time, I wondered if my desperate need to be accepted by my family had made me unworthy of God's love, if my willingness to disappear had been a betrayal of the woman He had created me to be. Outside my small window, Mrs. Patterson's house glowed with warm light. I imagined her inside, content with her solitude, tending to plants that responded to her care, reading books that interested her, living a life that belonged entirely to herself. "Am I being tested, or just forgotten?" I whispered into the darkness, the question carrying more weight than it ever had before. This time, I thought I heard an answer in the silence. "You are neither tested nor forgotten, my child. You are being called to remember who you are." The Tuesday after my forgotten birthday, I made what Emily would later call the most selfish decision of my life. I had been dusting the living room, moving around the furniture like a ghost tending to a shrine, when I noticed Grace's report card on the coffee table. Straight A's, except for one C+ in advanced biology. My heart swelled with pride and concern. Grace was brilliant, but science had never been her strongest subject. I remembered tutoring her last year when she struggled with chemistry, spending hours at the kitchen table breaking down complex equations until they made sense to her teenage mind. When she came home from school that afternoon, backpack slung over her shoulder and earbuds blocking out the world, I approached her with the gentle enthusiasm of a grandmother who still believed she had something valuable to offer. "Grace, honey, I saw your report card. Congratulations on those A's. You've worked so hard." She pulled out one earbud, her expression already guarded. "Thanks, Grandma. I noticed biology was a little challenging this quarter. If you'd like, I could help you study for the next test. Remember how we worked through stoichiometry last year?" Before Grace could respond, Emily's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Mom, what are you doing?" I turned to find my daughter standing in the doorway, her face flushed with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the moment. "I was just offering to help Grace with—" "You were interfering," Emily interrupted, stepping into the room with the commanding presence of someone asserting territorial rights. "Grace has her own study methods. She has tutors at school if she needs help. She doesn't need you hovering over her, making her feel inadequate." The words hit me like physical blows. Hovering, interfering, making her feel inadequate. I had been trying to show love, to offer the gift of my experience and knowledge, but somehow it had become another transgression. "I wasn't hovering," I said quietly, my voice carrying more hurt than I intended. "I was just trying to help." "You're always trying to help," Emily snapped, her voice rising. "You insert yourself into everything. Grace's homework, Tyler's soccer schedule, my cooking, Richard's work calls. You have opinions about everything, suggestions for everything, solutions for everything. It's suffocating." Grace stood frozen between us, her young face reflecting the discomfort of witnessing adult conflict that she didn't understand. I wanted to tell her this wasn't her fault. that the tension in this house had been building long before her report card appeared on the coffee table. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the apology automatic after years of practice. "I didn't mean to." "You never mean to," Emily continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train picking up speed. "But you do. Constantly. You criticize how I raise my children, how I run my household, how I manage my marriage. You act like you know better than everyone else. Like your way is the only right way." I stared at her, genuinely confused. When had I criticized her parenting? When had I suggested she was doing anything wrong? I had spent 6 years trying to be invisible, to avoid conflict, to support her decisions even when I disagreed with them. "Emily, I don't understand. I've never criticized." "Last week you told Grace she should eat more vegetables. Yesterday you suggested Tyler needed more structure in his after-school routine. This morning you rearranged the dishwasher because you thought I loaded it wrong. Every single day, it's something." Each accusation felt like a distortion of reality. I had offered Grace an apple when she reached for chips, worried about her nutrition. I had mentioned that Tyler seemed stressed about managing his homework and soccer practice, wondering if a schedule might help. I had reorganized the dishwasher because dishes were coming out still dirty, wasting water and electricity. But in Emily's retelling, these became acts of aggression, evidence of my inability to respect boundaries I didn't even know existed. "I was trying to help," I repeated, the words feeling increasingly hollow. "We don't need your help." Emily's voice cracked with frustration. "We need you to stop acting like you're still our mother instead of our... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Our what? Our burden? Our unwanted house guest? Our financial necessity that we tolerate but don't respect?" Richard appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. His expression was resigned, like someone who had witnessed this scene before and knew how it would end. "What's going on?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Your mother-in-law is trying to parent our children again," Emily said, her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that made me flinch. "I offered to help Grace with biology," I said, looking at Richard with hope that he might see reason, might recognize the innocence of my gesture. Richard sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Barbara, we've talked about this. Emily and I are the parents. We make the decisions about how to raise Tyler and Grace. Your role is to be supportive. In the background. In the background." The phrase echoed in my mind like a death sentence. I had spent 6 years trying to fade into the background, to be invisible until needed, to speak only when spoken to. But even that wasn't enough. Even the whispered offer to help a struggling granddaughter was too much presence, too much visibility. "I don't understand what I've done wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "I love this family. I love these children. I gave up everything to be here, to be close to you, to help in whatever way I could." "And that's the problem," Emily exploded, her composure finally shattering completely. "You gave up everything, so now you expect us to be everything. You expect us to be your whole world, your whole purpose, your whole reason for existing. It's too much pressure. We can't carry the weight of your happiness." The accusation stunned me into silence. I had thought I was being selfless, sacrificial, Christ-like in my devotion to family. But Emily saw it as selfish, as an unfair burden placed on their shoulders. "You don't have friends," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "You don't have hobbies. You don't have interests outside this house. You just exist here, watching us, waiting for us to need you, getting hurt when we don't. It's not healthy, Mom, for any of us." Grace had tears in her eyes now, and Tyler had appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion. My grandchildren were witnessing the systematic destruction of their grandmother's place in the family, and I was powerless to protect them from the ugliness of adult conflict. "Maybe," Richard said carefully, "it would be better if you had your own place, your own life, your own friends and activities that don't revolve around us." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. My own place. With what money? My Social Security barely covered my medications and personal expenses. The money from my house sale was tied up in their mortgage, their investment in family togetherness. "I can't afford my own place," I said quietly. "You know that." There are programs, Richard continued, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when discussing problematic clients. Senior communities, assisted living facilities, places where you could have your own space and socialize with people your own age. Assisted living, the euphemism for warehousing elderly people who had become inconvenient to their families. I had visited those places when Harold's mother was dying. Sterile environments where residents sat in wheelchairs, staring at television screens, waiting for death with dignity stripped away like expired insurance policies. "You want to put me in a nursing home," I said, the words barely audible. "Not a nursing home," Emily said quickly, perhaps recognizing that she had crossed a line. "Just somewhere you could be independent, somewhere you could have your own life instead of trying to live ours." But we all knew the truth. They wanted me gone. My presence, my love, my attempts to be useful, everything about me had become intolerable. I was the reminder of their obligations, the witness to their selfishness, the inconvenient truth that family meant more than convenience. "I need some air," I whispered, turning toward the door. "Mom, wait!" Emily called. But I was already walking away, my legs carrying me toward the front door with shaking determination. I walked through the neighborhood where I had never been welcomed, past houses where families lived without the burden of caring for elderly relatives. The evening air was cool against my face, but it couldn't cool the burning shame that consumed me from within. At the corner, I sat on a bus stop bench and pulled out my phone with trembling fingers. I dialed Winona's number, the only person in the world who still seemed to value my existence. "Barbara, are you all right? You sound upset." "They want me gone," I whispered into the phone. "They want to put me in a nursing home." "Oh, honey, where are you?" "At the bus stop on Maple Street. I can't go back there tonight. I can't face them. I'm coming to get you. Right now, don't move." As I waited for Winona, I watched the sun set over the neighborhood where I had never belonged. For the first time in 6 years, I allowed myself to ask the question that had been buried beneath layers of Christian duty and maternal love. What if loving my family meant something different than disappearing for them? What if the God who had created me in his image wanted me to exist, not as a shadow, but as a woman worthy of respect and dignity? The question felt dangerous, revolutionary, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a flood of suppressed truth. "Would Jesus forgive this too?" I whispered to the darkening sky. Should I forgive again? But for the first time, I wasn't sure I knew the answer. Winona's guest bedroom felt like sanctuary. For the first time in 6 years, I slept through the night without listening for footsteps in the hallway, without wondering if someone needed something, without the constant anxiety of existing in a space where my presence was merely tolerated. When morning light streamed through curtains that weren't chosen to avoid offending anyone else's taste, I experienced something I had almost forgotten, the simple luxury of waking up in a place where I was wanted. Winona had prepared coffee and set out her good china, not because I was company, but because she believed I deserved beautiful things. The gesture brought tears to my eyes as I realized how long it had been since someone had considered my comfort worth their effort. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the patient attention of a friend who had time for my pain. I told her about the forgotten birthday, the accusations of interference, the suggestion of assisted living. With each word, I watched Winona's expression shift from concern to outrage to something I didn't recognize at first. Fierce, protective love. "Barbara Morrison," she said when I finished, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had known me for 50 years. "What would you tell a student if their parents treated them the way Emily treats you?" The question stopped me cold. In my 37 years of teaching elementary school, I had been a mandated reporter, trained to recognize signs of emotional abuse and neglect. I had called Child Protective Services on parents who did to their children exactly what my family was doing to me, isolating them, controlling their resources, making them feel worthless and unwanted. I would tell them it wasn't their fault, I whispered. And that they deserved better. And that no one has the right to make them disappear. Winona nodded. "So why are you accepting from your family what you would never allow a child to endure?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. For 6 years, I had convinced myself that Christian love meant accepting whatever treatment my family offered. I had confused martyrdom with faithfulness, self-erasure with service to God. But Jesus hadn't made himself invisible. He had challenged those who mistreated others. He had spoken truth to power. He had set boundaries with people who tried to use him for their own purposes. I don't know how to stop, I admitted. I've been disappearing for so long. I'm not sure there's enough of me left to fight back. Winona reached across the table and took my hands. There's more of you left than you think, and it's time to let her out. That afternoon, she drove me to see a lawyer, not for divorce or custody battles, but to understand my rights regarding the money I had contributed to Emily's house. I learned that while I had no legal claim to the property itself, I could potentially recover some of my investment if I could prove I had made it under false pretenses. Your daughter told you the money would secure your place in the family home, the lawyer explained. She benefited from your contribution while simultaneously working to remove you from the residence. That could constitute a form of financial exploitation. The legal terminology felt harsh, but it described my situation with devastating accuracy. I had been financially exploited by my own daughter, who had used my love and my money to improve her family's circumstances, while planning to discard me when I became inconvenient. What are my options? I asked. You could file a claim to recover a portion of your investment. It wouldn't be everything, but it might be enough to secure independent housing. For the first time in years, I glimpsed a path forward that didn't depend on my family's approval or charity. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since moving into Emily's house. I cooked a meal for myself, not for a family that barely acknowledged my efforts, but for me. I prepared Harold's favorite chicken recipe, set Winona's table with cloth napkins, and said grace out loud without worrying about who might be offended by my faith. The food tasted like freedom. My phone buzzed throughout dinner, text messages from Emily asking where I was, when I was coming home, if I was having some kind of breakdown. The last message made me laugh out loud, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. Having a breakdown, I told Winona. I think I'm having a breakthrough. The next morning, I made my first executive decision in 6 years. I called Emily and told her I wouldn't be returning to her house that day, or the next. I needed time to think, to pray, to figure out what God actually wanted from my life. Mom, you're being ridiculous, Emily said, her voice carrying the exasperated tone she used with Tyler when he threw tantrums. You can't just run away from your responsibilities. What responsibilities? I asked, the question surprising both of us with its directness. What exactly am I responsible for in your house? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. We both knew the answer. Nothing that mattered. I was responsible for staying invisible, for not needing anything, for being grateful for scraps of attention while contributing far more than I consumed. You live here, Emily said finally. This is your home. No, I replied, the word feeling powerful on my tongue. Your house is where I'm allowed to exist quietly in exchange for financial contributions. That's not the same thing as home. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking but my heart surprisingly steady. That afternoon, I walked to the small Catholic church near Winona's house, not because I was suddenly converting, but because I needed to sit in a sacred space and have an honest conversation with God. The sanctuary was empty except for an elderly man praying the rosary in the front pew and a few votive candles flickering near the altar. I slipped into a back pew and opened my Bible to Matthew 10:34-36. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother. The verses had always troubled me, seeming to contradict Jesus' message of love and forgiveness. But sitting in that quiet church, I began to understand them differently. Sometimes love required disruption. Sometimes faithfulness meant refusing to enable destructive patterns. Sometimes peace came only after the courage to fight for what was right. I prayed differently that day, not for patience to endure mistreatment, but for wisdom to know the difference between Christian sacrifice and Christian doormat behavior. I asked God to help me love my family without disappearing myself. I asked for strength to set boundaries without hatred, to demand respect without bitterness. When I opened my eyes, the late afternoon sun was streaming through the stained glass windows. casting colored light across the empty pews. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope that God's plan for my life included dignity, purpose, and the radical idea that I mattered. That evening, I called Tyler's cell phone. At 13, he was old enough to understand more than his parents gave him credit for, and I wanted him to hear directly from me that my absence wasn't his fault. "Grandma?" His voice was small, confused. "Mom says you're mad at us." "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. I'm not mad at Grace either. You two are the lights of my life. Then why won't you come home?" The question broke my heart, but I knew I had to tell him the truth in words he could understand. Sometimes adults need time to figure things out. Your mom and dad and I have different ideas about what family means, and we need to talk about it honestly. "Are you coming back?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his question. "I don't know yet, Tyler. But I promise you this. No matter what happens between me and your parents, I will always be your grandmother. I will always love you and Grace. And when you're older, I hope you'll understand that sometimes loving someone means making hard choices." After I hung up, I sat in Winona's living room and made a list, something I used to do when facing difficult decisions in my teaching career. On one side, I wrote everything I had given up to live with Emily's family. On the other, I wrote everything I had gained. The given up column filled an entire page. My independence, my friendships, my sense of self-worth, my financial security, my right to have opinions, my ability to practice my faith openly, my simple pleasures like cooking meals I enjoyed and decorating my own space. The gained column had 3 items: proximity to Tyler and Grace, Emily's occasional acknowledgement of my existence, and the illusion that I was part of a family. Looking at that list, I realized I had made the worst bargain in history. I had traded my entire identity for the promise of belonging that was never actually fulfilled. That night, I slept deeply again, and in my dreams, I was back in my own house with Harold, tending a garden where everything I planted grew strong and beautiful, because it had room to breathe, space to flourish, and soil rich enough to support its roots. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. I was going to file that legal claim. I was going to recover what I could of my investment. And I was going to build a life that honored the woman God had created me to be, not the shadow my family wanted me to become. For the first time in 6 years, I felt like Barbara Morrison again, and it was glorious. The meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon in the conference room of Winona's lawyer's office. Emily and Richard arrived 15 minutes late, their faces wearing expressions of barely contained irritation mixed with bewilderment. They had expected a family discussion, perhaps an intervention to bring their wayward mother back into line. Instead, they found themselves facing legal documentation and a woman they no longer recognized. I had dressed carefully that morning. My navy blue dress, the one I had worn to parent-teacher conferences when I needed to project authority and competence. My hands were steady as I held my purse, the same composure I had maintained during difficult conversations with parents who didn't want to hear that their children needed extra help. "I don't understand what this is about," Emily said as she took her seat across from me, her voice carrying the wounded tone of someone who believed herself to be the victim of an incomprehensible betrayal. "Why couldn't we handle this at home? Why do we need lawyers?" Richard remained silent, but his eyes were calculating, already assessing the potential financial implications of whatever legal action I was contemplating. I recognized that look from the few times I had glimpsed him reviewing pharmaceutical contracts, the expression of a man determining how to minimize his losses. My lawyer, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, was a woman in her 60s who had built her practice defending elderly clients against financial exploitation by family members. She had seen countless cases like mine, she had told me, and approached each one with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. "Your mother has engaged our services regarding the financial contributions she made to your household," Mrs. Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Specifically, the $180,000 from her house sale that was used for your mortgage down payment, and the ongoing monthly contributions from her Social Security that have totaled approximately $87,000 over the past 6 years. Emily's face went pale. That money was a gift, a contribution to the family. "According to our documentation," Mrs. Walsh continued, sliding papers across the table, Your mother was told these contributions would secure her permanent place in the family home and guarantee her care as she aged. The implied contract was that in exchange for her financial investment, she would be treated as a valued family member with full rights to the residence she helped purchase. She is a valued family member, Richard interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Walsh looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had heard every excuse imaginable. Mr. Walker, yesterday you left a voicemail on your mother-in-law's phone suggesting she consider assisted living facilities. Today, we're here because she has been systematically isolated, marginalized, and treated as an unwelcome burden in the home she financially supported. I watched Emily's face as the reality of the situation settled over her. For the first time in 6 years, the power dynamic in our relationship had shifted. She couldn't dismiss me, interrupt me, or send me to my room. She had to listen, really listen, to words that came from a place of strength rather than desperate pleading. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, my hands folded on the conference table, and looked directly into my daughter's eyes. "I want you to understand what you've done to me. I want you to see that the woman who gave up everything for you deserved better than to be treated like an inconvenient obligation." "We didn't treat you badly," Emily protested, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "You forgot my birthday," I said calmly. "You made me feel ashamed for offering to help Grace with her homework. You discussed putting me in a nursing home as if I were a piece of furniture you wanted to store. You took my money, my house, my independence, and then treated me like I was ungrateful when I dared to exist in your presence." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Barbara, we provided you with housing, food, care. You provided me with a room in exchange for financial contributions that far exceeded my living expenses," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. "You provided me with the privilege of being ignored, dismissed, and made to feel like a burden for breathing too loudly in my own space." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but I could see they were tears of frustration rather than remorse. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. Families work things out. They don't hire lawyers and make threats." For the first time in the meeting, I smiled, not with anger or bitterness, but with the peace of someone who had found her footing after years of being knocked off balance. "Emily, honey, I tried to work things out for 6 years. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, more convenient. I tried to love you so perfectly that you would want me around, but you taught me that my love, my presence, my very existence was something you tolerated rather than treasured." "That's not true," she whispered, but we both knew it was. Mrs. Walsh placed another document on the table. "Your mother is prepared to file a claim for the return of her financial contributions under the legal theory of unjust enrichment. However, she's also prepared to consider an alternative arrangement." Richard leaned forward, his business instincts engaging. "What kind of arrangement?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was my chance to speak truth with love, to set boundaries without hatred, to choose dignity without destroying relationships. "I forgive you," I said, the words carrying more power than any legal threat. "I forgive you for treating me like I was worthless. I forgive you for making me feel like my love was a burden rather than a gift. But I won't enable you anymore." Emily stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. The concept of forgiveness without capitulation, of love without doormat behavior, was apparently beyond her comprehension. "I want $100,000 from the house sale returned to me," I continued. "That will give me enough to secure independent housing and live with dignity. In exchange, I'll forgive the remaining debt and release any claim to your property." "We don't have $100,000, Richard said quickly. "Then you'll refinance," Mrs. Walsh replied smoothly. "Given the equity you've built in the property with Mrs. Morrison's down payment, that shouldn't be difficult." Emily found her voice. "And then what? You'll just disappear from our lives? Abandon your grandchildren?" The accusation was designed to wound, to make me feel guilty for choosing my own well-being over their convenience. But I had prepared for this moment through hours of prayer and reflection. "I will love Tyler and Grace for the rest of my life," I said firmly, "but I will love them from a place of strength rather than desperation. I will be their grandmother, not their burden. And maybe, if they see me living with dignity and self-respect, I can teach them something valuable about how people should treat each other. You're being selfish, Emily said, her voice rising. You're putting your hurt feelings above family unity. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 73 years, but also feeling more alive than I had in decades. Emily, I spent 6 years putting family unity above my basic human dignity. I called it Christian love, but I think God is calling me to something different now. I reached into my purse and pulled out my worn Bible, opening it to a passage I had marked the night before. Matthew 10:39 says, "Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. I lost my life trying to earn your love. Now I'm finding it by choosing to love myself the way God loves me." Emily stared at me, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who had crawled into my lap when she was scared, who had held my hand crossing busy streets, who had once told me I was the best mommy in the whole world. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. My heart broke and healed simultaneously. "You don't have to lose me, sweetheart, but you do have to choose to truly have me. Not as a convenient ATM or a live-in servant, but as your mother who deserves love and respect." Richard was already calculating. I could see it in his expression. $100,000 was less than they would lose if I pursued full legal action. It was a business decision, nothing more. "We'll need time to arrange the financing," he said finally. Mrs. Walsh nodded. "You have 30 days. Until then, Mrs. Morrison will be staying elsewhere." As we prepared to leave, Emily reached out and grabbed my hand. "Mom, I'm sorry. I really am. I didn't think—" I squeezed her fingers gently. "I know, honey, but thinking about it isn't enough anymore. If you want me in your life, you need to show me that my presence is a gift, not a burden. You need to treat me like someone you actually want around. And if we do? If we change?" I smiled at her, feeling the love that had never died despite everything that had happened between us. "Then maybe we can build something real this time, something based on mutual respect instead of financial obligation." As I walked out of that conference room, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won some victory over my family, but because I had finally remembered who I was. Barbara Morrison, child of God, worthy of love and respect, strong enough to demand both without apology. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in 6 years, I was fighting for something worth having, my own soul. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of my own apartment for the first time in 6 years. The keys felt substantial in my palm, their weight representing something I had almost forgotten existed: the right to control my own space, my own time, my own life. The apartment was small but perfect, a 1-bedroom unit in a senior-friendly complex called Sunset Gardens, 20 minutes from Emily's house but worlds away from the suffocating atmosphere I had escaped. The living room had large windows that faced east, ensuring morning sunlight would stream across my Bible during daily devotions. The kitchen was compact but functional, with enough counter space to prepare meals for myself and the occasional guest who actually wanted my company. But most importantly, it was mine. Every decision about furniture placement, wall color, and decoration reflected my preferences rather than someone else's tolerance for my existence. Winona helped me move in, along with Tyler and Grace. My grandchildren had insisted on participating despite their parents' obvious discomfort with the arrangement. Watching Tyler carefully carry my few remaining possessions up the stairs, I marveled at how my decision to choose dignity had given him permission to show love openly, rather than hiding it to avoid family conflict. "Grandma, can we help you pick out new furniture?" Grace asked, her young face bright with excitement. "I saw some really pretty chairs at the thrift store that would look amazing by your window." The suggestion made me smile. In Emily's house, Grace had barely acknowledged my presence. Now, freed from the toxic dynamics that had poisoned our family relationships, she was discovering that her grandmother was actually someone worth knowing. "I would love your help, sweetheart," I replied, meaning every word. The $100,000 settlement had arrived exactly 30 days after our meeting, accompanied by a brief note from Richard's attorney confirming the terms of our agreement. No personal message from Emily or Richard, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused or the relationship they had damaged. Just a business transaction concluding a business arrangement, but I felt no bitterness about their clinical approach. Their inability to offer genuine apology or show authentic remorse was information, not insult. It told me everything I needed to know about where we stood and what I could realistically expect from future interactions. With Winona's help, I had found this apartment, purchased basic furniture, and established the routines that would define my new life. For the first time since Harold's death, I woke up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than dreading the emotional landmines I would have to navigate. My mornings began with coffee and prayer in my sunny living room, my Bible open on the small table I had positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. No more whispered prayers in a cramped bedroom. No more hiding my faith to avoid making others uncomfortable. I could praise God as loudly as I wanted, sing hymns while cooking breakfast, leave my rosary on the kitchen counter without apologizing for its presence. The freedom to practice my faith openly felt like emerging from a cave into brilliant sunshine. I had joined St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, not because I was abandoning my Presbyterian roots, but because their senior ministry program offered exactly what I needed: community, purpose, and opportunities to serve others, rather than simply being served. The pastor, Father Michael, was a man in his 40s who had grown up caring for his aging grandmother and understood the unique challenges facing elderly people in modern families. "Mrs. Morrison," he had said during our first meeting, "I want you to know that your experience isn't uncommon. Many older adults find themselves caught between their desire to maintain independence and their family's need to control their circumstances. Finding the balance requires wisdom, courage, and faith." Through the church's senior outreach program, I began volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching reading skills to adults who had never learned or had lost their abilities due to illness or injury. The work reminded me why I had become a teacher in the first place. Not for recognition or gratitude, but for the profound satisfaction of watching someone discover their own capabilities. "Mrs. Barbara," said Maria, a 60-year-old woman learning to read so she could help her grandson with homework. "You make me feel smart instead of stupid. How do you do that?" The question brought tears to my eyes because I realized that for 6 years, I had forgotten how to make anyone feel valued and capable. I had been so focused on earning approval that I had lost touch with my gift for seeing potential in others and helping them realize it. My Tuesday afternoons were spent at the community center, participating in a grief support group for widows and widowers. Initially, I had attended to process my feelings about Harold's death, but I discovered that my more recent grief, the loss of the family relationships I had thought were real, required equal attention and healing. "I gave up everything for them," shared Dorothy, a woman whose adult children had moved her from Florida to Minnesota without consulting her preferences. "My friends, my house, my independence. And now they act like I should be grateful for the privilege of being completely dependent on their charity." The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Elderly parents who had sacrificed autonomy for proximity to family, only to discover that love without respect wasn't really love at all. But in sharing our experiences, we found strength and solidarity. We reminded each other that our worth wasn't determined by our family's ability to appreciate us. My Wednesday evenings belonged to a book club that met at the local library. We read everything from contemporary fiction to spiritual memoirs, engaging in discussions that challenged my thinking and expanded my perspective. For the first time in years, people were interested in my opinions, my insights, my interpretations of complex themes. "Barbara, what did you think about the mother-daughter relationship in this novel?" asked Janet, our group facilitator. I found myself analyzing fictional family dynamics with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had lived through similar challenges. My contributions to our discussions were valued, quoted, remembered from week to week. I mattered to these people not because I paid their bills or stayed out of their way, but because my thoughts and experiences enriched their understanding of the world. The most surprising development in my new life was the friendship I struck up with my neighbor, Mrs. Elizabeth Chen, a widow in her late 60s who had moved into Sunset Gardens after selling the restaurant she and her husband had operated for 30 years. Elizabeth was everything I had forgotten I could be: opinionated, laughing, curious about life, unafraid to take up space in the world. "Barbara," she said one afternoon as we sat on the small patio outside my apartment, sharing tea and watching the sunset, "you seem different than when you first moved in. Stronger somehow." I considered her observation as I sipped the jasmine tea she had brought from her extensive collection. "I think I'm remembering who I used to be, before I started apologizing for existing." "And who were you?" The question required real thought. For so long I had defined myself in relation to others: Harold's wife, Emily's mother, Tyler and Grace's grandmother. But stripped of those external identities, who was Barbara Morrison? "I was a teacher," I said slowly. "Someone who believed every person had potential worth developing. I was curious about everything: books, ideas, people's stories. I laughed easily. I had strong opinions about things that mattered to me. I could be stubborn when I believed I was right." Elizabeth smiled. "That woman sounds like someone I'd want to be friends with." "She's someone I'd like to be friends with too," I replied, surprised by the realization. My relationship with Tyler and Grace had deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Free from the pressure to earn my place in their lives, I could simply enjoy their company and offer them the gift of an adult who listened without judgment or agenda. Tyler called me twice a week to discuss everything from school struggles to friend drama, to his growing questions about faith and purpose. "Grandma, do you think God really listens to prayers?" he asked during one of our conversations. "I think God listens to everything," I replied. "But sometimes the answer isn't what we expect or want. Sometimes God's answer is giving us the strength to change situations that aren't working instead of the patience to endure them forever." Grace had started visiting me every other Saturday, usually bringing homework or art projects that gave us activities to share. But more importantly, she brought questions about becoming a woman, about relationships, about how to know when someone truly loves you versus when they're just using you. "How do you tell the difference, Grandma?" she asked one afternoon as we worked on a school project about family history. I set down my scissors and looked at her seriously. "People who love you want you to be yourself, even when it's inconvenient for them. People who are using you want you to be whatever makes their lives easier, even when it makes you disappear." She nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you moved out? Because Mom and Dad wanted you to disappear?" The question was painful but necessary. "Your parents love me, Grace, but they didn't know how to love me and respect me at the same time. Sometimes people need space to figure out how to do both. Are you happier now?" I looked around my small apartment, at the photos I had chosen for the walls, the books stacked on shelves according to my preferences, the kitchen table where I ate meals I had selected and prepared for my own enjoyment. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm happier. Not because I wanted to leave your family, but because I needed to remember that I'm worth loving even when love requires effort from other people." As spring turned to summer, I realized that my life had acquired a rhythm and richness I had almost forgotten was possible. Each day brought opportunities to learn, to serve, to connect with others, to discover new aspects of myself that had been buried under years of trying to be whatever other people needed me to be. I was no longer waiting for someone else's approval to feel valuable. I was no longer measuring my worth by how little space I occupied or how few needs I expressed. I was living as the woman God had created me to be: complex, capable, deserving of love and respect, worthy of taking up space in the world. And for the first time in 6 years, when I knelt beside my bed each night for evening prayers, I thanked God not for patience to endure mistreatment, but for the courage to demand better. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered into the peaceful darkness of my own bedroom, "for reminding me that your children are meant to flourish, not just survive." The woman I had become was someone I was proud to know, and tomorrow, she would wake up in her own space, make her own choices, and live her own life with the full blessing of the God who had never wanted her to disappear. 1 year later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner, not for a family that tolerated my presence, but for people who had chosen to spend their holiday with me. The aroma of roasted turkey filled my small apartment, mixing with the scent of homemade stuffing and pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. For the first time in 7 years, I was cooking a holiday meal with joy instead of anxiety. Elizabeth had offered to host the gathering in her larger apartment, but I had insisted on doing it myself. After years of having my contributions dismissed or criticized, I wanted to create something beautiful in my own space, to prove to myself that I was still capable of nurturing others without losing myself in the process. My guests began arriving at 2 o'clock. Winona came first, carrying a bottle of wine and the warm smile that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life. Dorothy and Janet from my support group followed, along with Maria from the Literacy Center and Father Michael from church. Even Mrs. Patterson, my former neighbor, had driven over from the old neighborhood, bringing her famous sweet potato casserole. But the arrivals that meant the most to me were Tyler and Grace, who had asked permission to spend Thanksgiving with me instead of attending their parents' formal dinner party. At 14 and 16 now, they were old enough to make their own decisions about how to spend their time and with whom they wanted to share important moments. "Grandma, this smells incredible," Tyler said, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "I've missed your cooking so much." Grace appeared behind him, carrying a homemade centerpiece she had crafted in her art class, an arrangement of autumn leaves and small pumpkins that she placed proudly in the center of my dining table. "I wanted to contribute something beautiful to your beautiful dinner." As we gathered around the table that had become the heart of my new life, I looked at each face illuminated by the warm light of the candles Grace had lit. These were people who had chosen to be here, who valued my company enough to spend their holiday in my small apartment instead of anywhere else they could have gone. "Before we eat," I said, standing at the head of the table, "I'd like to say grace." The words carried weight that went beyond their religious significance. For years, I had whispered prayers to avoid offending anyone. Now I spoke them aloud, clearly and confidently, as expressions of gratitude from a woman who had learned the difference between being humble and being humiliated. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together on this day of gratitude. We thank you for second chances, for new beginnings, and for the courage to build lives that honor the people you created us to be. We thank you for the food we're about to share, but more importantly, for the love that has brought us to this table. In Jesus' name, amen." The conversation that followed was rich with laughter, stories, and the kind of deep sharing that happens when people feel safe to be themselves. Dorothy talked about her decision to move back to Florida, choosing proximity to lifelong friends over proximity to children who treated her like a burden. Maria shared news about her grandson's academic progress, made possible by the reading skills she had developed in our program. Tyler discussed his plans for college, his growing interest in social work, and his desire to help families navigate difficult situations with more grace and understanding than he had witnessed in his own childhood. Grace talked about her art, her dreams of studying design, and her growing awareness of how family dynamics affected everyone's ability to flourish. "Grandma," Grace said as we cleared the dinner plates, "I want you to know that watching you choose yourself taught me something important about self-respect. I won't let anyone treat me the way you were treated. Not friends, not boyfriends, not even family." The words hit me with the force of revelation. My decision to demand dignity hadn't just changed my own life. It had shown my granddaughter that she deserved to be valued, respected, and loved for who she was, rather than what she could provide for others. "That's the greatest gift you could give me," I replied, my voice thick with emotion, "knowing that my story helped you understand your own worth." As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Father Michael lingered to help with the final cleanup. "Barbara," he said as we wrapped leftover turkey, "I want you to know that your transformation has been inspiring to watch. You've shown our entire congregation what it looks like to choose faith over fear, dignity over desperation." "I'm not sure I chose anything," I replied honestly. "I think I was just finally ready to receive what God had been trying to give me all along. The knowledge that His children are meant to be treasured, not tolerated." "That's exactly what I mean," he smiled. "You've become a living testament to the truth that it's never too late to claim the life God intended for you." After everyone left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the pleasant chaos of a successful gathering. Dishes to be washed, leftover food to be stored, memories to be treasured. But instead of feeling exhausted by the work of hospitality, I felt energized by the joy of sharing my home with people who genuinely wanted to be there. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emily. "Hope you had a nice Thanksgiving. Kids said dinner was wonderful." It was the first contact I'd had with her in 3 months. Not an apology, not an invitation to reconcile, just a brief acknowledgement that Tyler and Grace had chosen to spend the holiday with me. But buried in those few words, I sensed something that might have been the beginning of respect. I replied simply, "It was beautiful. Thank you." I didn't elaborate on the details of my celebration or extend an invitation for future contact. I had learned that relationships built on mutual respect required both parties to make effort, and I was no longer willing to carry the entire emotional load of maintaining connections with people who saw me as an obligation rather than a gift. The following week, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer, Mrs. Walsh. Richard had been arrested for falsifying pharmaceutical trial data, and the legal proceedings had revealed a pattern of corruption that stretched back several years. The news should have brought me satisfaction, vindication for the man who had treated me with such casual cruelty. Instead, I felt only sadness for the choices that had led him to that moment, and concern for how the scandal would affect Tyler and Grace. "The authorities want to interview you," Mrs. Walsh explained. "Apparently, you were present in their home during the time period when some of the alleged crimes occurred. They're hoping you might have witnessed something relevant to their investigation." I had indeed witnessed something relevant. Richard's late-night phone calls discussing trial modifications, his stress over FDA inquiries, his expensive purchases that seemed disproportionate to his legitimate income. But I also knew that testifying against him would further damage my already fragile relationship with Emily and potentially hurt my grandchildren. "I'll tell the truth," I said finally. "Whatever I saw, whatever I heard, I'll report honestly. But I won't speculate or exaggerate to settle old scores." The interview with federal investigators took place in a downtown office building, and I answered their questions with the same straightforward honesty I had brought to my teaching career. Yes, I had observed Richard's behavior during evening phone calls. Yes, I had heard him discussing modifications to trial data. No, I had not understood the full implications of what I was witnessing at the time. When the investigators asked why I had never reported my suspicions, I paused to consider the question carefully. "Because I was focused on surviving in that household," I replied. "I was so worried about being seen as troublesome or ungrateful that I ignored signs of behavior that made me uncomfortable. I prioritized keeping peace over seeking truth." The admission was painful, but necessary. My years of desperate accommodation had made me complicit in my own silence, had prevented me from speaking up when I witnessed wrongdoing, because I was terrified of giving my family any additional reasons to reject me. But I was no longer that woman. The Barbara Morrison who sat in that sterile office building was someone who understood that truth-telling was not betrayal, that loyalty did not require silence in the face of harmful behavior, that love sometimes demanded the courage to speak difficult truths. 6 months later, Richard was convicted and sentenced to federal prison. Emily lost her job at the medical clinic where she had worked, and their house, the house I had helped purchase, was seized as part of the legal settlement with Richard's victims. Tyler and Grace moved in with Richard's parents, while Emily struggled to rebuild her career and reputation. I might have expected to feel vindicated by their downfall, but instead I felt grief for the family that had been destroyed by secrets, lies, and the kind of ethical compromise that had poisoned every relationship in its wake. Their suffering brought me no joy, only a deeper understanding of how destructive behavior ultimately destroys the people who practice it. When Tyler called to tell me about the move, his voice was heavy with the weight of adult knowledge that had come too early. "Grandma, I understand now why you left. The house was full of lies, wasn't it? Not just Dad's lies, but the way we all pretended everything was fine when it wasn't." "Yes, sweetheart," I replied gently, "and I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way." "Are you sorry you testified against Dad?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry your father made choices that hurt people. I'm sorry those choices destroyed your family, but I'm not sorry for telling the truth when I was asked to do so. Truth-telling is an act of love, even when it's painful." As winter turned to spring in my second year of independent living, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from desperation to dignity. The woman who had once whispered prayers to avoid offending anyone now led a Bible study group at the community center. The woman who had apologized for existing now volunteered as an advocate for other elderly people facing family exploitation. I had learned that God's love was not demonstrated through my willingness to disappear, but through my courage to claim the life He had given me. I had discovered that Christian forgiveness did not require enabling harmful behavior, that mercy did not demand martyrdom, that grace could be offered without sacrificing self-respect. Most importantly, I had remembered that I was Barbara Morrison, not just Emily's mother or Tyler and Grace's grandmother, but a woman created in God's image, worthy of love and respect, capable of building a life filled with purpose and joy. As I prepared for another day of teaching adults to read, of supporting grieving widows, of sharing meals with friends who valued my company, I offered my daily prayer of gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for never giving up on me. Thank you for loving me enough to demand that I love myself. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become the person you created me to be. The harvest of my new life was abundant, not in material wealth, but in relationships built on mutual respect, service that honored my gifts, and the deep peace that comes from living authentically in God's love. I had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not enduring suffering, but choosing flourishing. Sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is refuse to let others treat you as less than the beloved child of God you are. And in that choice, I had found not just survival, but resurrection. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Like your love was taken for granted while your needs were ignored? Have you ever wondered if God truly wants His children to disappear in the name of keeping peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it. May God bless everyone who has ever felt forgotten or unworthy of love. You are seen, you are valued, and you deserve to flourish in the light of His grace. In Jesus' name, amen.